Oh, how I wish I was in Peoria, Peoria tonight. Oh, how I miss the mud in Peoria, Peoria tonight.
Before you came up, my monument is just right up the hill here. You see the silver gray pillar there with the Wead family name at the bottom. Since 1855, when my grandfather Hezekiah Wead moved here from Vermont, the Wead family has been in Peoria. Hezekiah, he was a judge and a lawyer here in town. He had originally moved to Lewiston and started his law practice there, and then he moved to Peoria in 1855 and became a judge here in town, as did my father, Samuel Wead. I took a little different route. My name's Frank Wilbur Wead. Some of you may know me by my nickname, Spig, S-P-I-G. There is an S at the beginning of it. I'm a little embarrassed when people ask me what that nickname came from, because nowadays it's not so politically correct. But in my day, it just simply meant that I was a person who was interested in traveling and seeing people from different cultures, and people who wore different kinds of clothes and spoke different languages. Does that make that clear? No. Okay. For those of you who don't get that yet, let me give you another hint. Let's say I went to France and I went to a restaurant and I wanted to order off the menu, but being a typical American in the 1820s or 1920s, I probably spoke American and not much else. So I would ask the waiter, do you speak English? Speak the English. Spiggity English? Spiggity. That's the origins of it. Nowadays we say spick, and that has some really bad connotations, so you won't see too many people with that nickname today, except for one Vietnam fighter pilot who took the name Spig Wead on the side of his plane, which was kind of nice in honor of me. Well, I'm getting way ahead of myself here. Yesterday when I started my talk, I introduced myself as John Wayne. I'll explain why I did that later. I grew up in Peoria, as I said. When I was 16, I applied for the Naval Academy at Annapolis and was accepted, I think probably because of the influence of my father and grandfather, their influence as judges. But I became a naval officer in 1916, Ensign Frank Wead, and I received my first combat duty assignment during World War I aboard the USS Shawmut, which was stationed out of Inverness, Scotland. I was on a mine layer. Now, back in those days, the purpose of the mine layers was anti-U-boat operations. See, back then, or at least prior to World War I, all of the Navy's battles were done on the surface of the sea. And with the U-boats, it all of a sudden made the Navy two-dimensional. We had to deal with people being under the surface. Well, we didn't have any real technology to fight submarines. Our deck guns were basically the only weapon we had against them. But the Navy got smart, and they began Navy aviation. Of course, in those days, Navy aviation was a blimp with a basket on the back of it that was tethered to the back of the ship and had about a 200-foot tether. And some guy would sit in the bottom of that basket and look out over the ocean and look for U-boats. You know, U-boats didn't have a whole lot of range underwater in those days. They were diesel powered. And so they might be able to spend an hour or two underwater at the most. And to get within range of torpedoes, they almost always had to get surface within observation of our blimps. So that was pretty much my war duty during World War I. After the war, I was stationed on my ship still at Boston Naval Harbor, or Naval Shipyards, where we started to actually pursue this naval aviation thing a little bit better. See, during World War I, the Army had airplanes, starting out as reconnaissance planes over Europe, and then eventually bombers, and finally fighters. And the Navy said, well, we should be able to do something with that. The problem with planes didn't have a whole lot of range back then. So they started working with pontoons. And they took a plane like the Curtiss C, which is a two-seater where the pilot sits in the front and the navigator gunner sits in the back, and put pontoons on it. And so now airplanes could take off and land on water. Well, unfortunately, they still didn't have much range. In fact, in 1923, I set the speed, distance, and duration records for this particular seaplane. We could go about 1,000 miles, but 960 miles was the furthest range we could make on one of these planes. We could fly in the air for nearly 14 hours, 13 hours and 53 minutes, and we could reach these dazzling speeds, unheard of before, of 75 miles an hour. And it was during this time, as a naval test pilot, that I was asked to captain the U.S. team in the Snyder Cup or Snyder Trophy races, depending on whether you're from Europe or America. We call it a trophy here, they call it a cup over there. One of my pilots, Jimmy Doolittle, you probably know that guy. Now Jimmy Doolittle, he was an Army pilot. And for the Snyder Cup races, both the Army and the Navy combined in order to compete against England and France and some of the other nations that were involved in the Snyder Cup. Well, Jimmy Doolittle, for those of you who don't know the name, was famous for the 30 seconds over Tokyo raid off the USS Hornet in 1942, which after World War II started with Pearl Harbor, was the first time that the U.S. actually made an attack against the mainland of Japan. Well, we'll get more back to Jimmy Doolittle here in a second. Well, as captain of the Snyder Cup races, you might have heard that sometimes Navy guys and Army guys didn't get along very well. Well, that was only when we were off duty. When we were on duty, we were as competitive as anybody, much like NASCAR races are today. You know, trying to push the limits of car performance. That's what we did as naval and Army aviators. Well, by 1925, my student, my protege, Jimmy Doolittle, was able to smash my 75-mile-an-hour record by going 235 miles an hour in the Curtiss C. Now that tells you something about how fast technology advances when you start to actually do something about it. Distance and durations were pretty much the same, but it was the speed that really made a difference in naval warfare. About this same time, 1925, another Army officer by the name of Billy Mitchell was on trial in the court-martial for insubordination. He had the nerve to suggest that the War Department, which we now call the Pentagon or the Defense Department, was wasting money. Huh, like things ever change, right? The Navy was saying the future of the Navy and the future of warfare on the seas was battleships. And Billy Mitchell said, no, the future is aircraft carriers. We need to build a platform from which our planes can now take off from the middle of the ocean rather than having to, you know, be at seaports where they can actually land and come return to. Well, he was convicted of insubordination, reduced in rank, and pretty much removed from all active duty for a while. Interestingly enough, the one judge who was on the court-martial who voted for acquittal was Douglas MacArthur, who would become famous later for I Will Return to the Philippines and for the being in charge of the Korean War during that battle, or during that conflict. So, being interested in naval aviation and aircraft carriers, just like Billy Mitchell was, I followed that trial very carefully and began to become an advocate in my writing for aircraft carriers. Unfortunately, in April of 1926, I fell down a flight of stairs, some daredevil, huh? Breaking the 5th cervical vertebrae in my neck, and I was no longer able to fly. So much for naval aviation, right? Boy, I can hear myself now. And yet, as depressed and as feeling as worthless as I did because I was no longer able to walk, I had a great friend who encouraged me to continue my advocacy of naval aviation through my writing. And so I did. I began to write not just essays and short stories, but full novels and plays and movie screenplays, some of which you may have heard of. Test Pilot, for example, and The Citadel were both made into films nominated for Academy Awards for my writing. My first one, The Flying Fleet, was made into a silent film in 1929, starring the famous silent movie star Ramon Navarro. And so I became an advocate, much like Bob Hope did with the USO, through Hollywood for raising public awareness about the need for naval aviation advancement, and in particular, aircraft carriers. When World War II broke out, although I was in steel braces from my hips to my ankles and only able to walk with the assistance of 2 canes, walked, well, that's kind of a strange way of saying it. Basically, I just kind of threw myself forward and propped myself up on the cane, much like our president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had to do when he tried to walk. I offered my services to the War Department, and surprise, surprise, my service was accepted. I was granted the rank of lieutenant commander and assigned to the planning division of the Pacific Theater, reporting directly to the commander of the Pacific Fleet. Now, it was basically a desk job until 1943, when I was granted the opportunity to serve on both the USS Yorktown and the USS Essex, new aircraft carriers that existed partly because of my work in public relations and Billy Mitchell's arguments from the 1925 trial. I told you I'd get back to Jimmy Doolittle. Well, Jimmy Doolittle led the raid off the USS Hornet against Japan in 1942, flying a B-25, small or medium bomber, depending on your perspective. That bomber was named the Billy Mitchell bomber, and it's the only military plane that's ever been named after a soldier or an airman. So it was quite an honor that Billy Mitchell, Jimmy Doolittle, and I could all be kind of connected into that one single event. I retired from the service in 1945 after being awarded the Legion of Merit for my service both at the battles of Marianas and Kwajalein, and for my service in Hollywood in raising public awareness for the need for naval aviation. I died just a couple years later, in 1947, from complications from surgery in trying to fix my broken back. Now, that's not the end of the story, thank goodness. In 1957, the great director John Ford produced a film called Wings of Eagles. I don't know if any of you have ever saw it or not, but in it he cast John Wayne to play a young naval aviator by the name of Spig Wead. So at the beginning when I said I was John Wayne, well, actually it was the other way around. John Wayne was me. Ward Bond, Ken Curtis, Dan Daly, and Maureen O'Hara, all these Hollywood big stars, starred in this film to celebrate my life, and it was quite an honor. So although I did get to contribute to the advancements of naval aviation and to entertainment in Hollywood, raising morale during the war, I never did get to be a movie star. I'm Frank Wead, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you.